Hi, it's Friday, April 3rd, 2026, and this is Washington in Focus for your Good Friday. I'm Carleen Johnson, the Center Square's state government reporter. And in today's episode, the first legal challenge has been made against the state's so-called millionaires tax. This is a lawsuit against Secretary of State Steve Hobbs over his decision to block a public vote on the new state law, which was signed by Governor Bob Ferguson this week. We're going to get into that with the lawsuit challenger, Let's Go Washington, and founder of Let's Go Washington, Brian Haywood, and why he says they're taking sort of a three-pronged approach to their challenge to the millionaire's tax, or what many believe will be eventually a tax on all income earners in the state of Washington. Likely two initiatives to come, which Let's Go Washington is going to be behind those, as well as this legal challenge to the referendum rejection from the Secretary of State. So they've got three irons in the fire on this, but we're going to get into his reasoning for why he thinks it's important to go all of those routes. Then, while the income tax is, of course, aimed at millionaires, for now, we've talked a lot about impacts on small business. And former Representative Kelly Chambers, herself a small business owner, is the new regional administrator for the U.S. Small Business Administration, the SBA, serving Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Alaska for President Trump. This was a position she was tapped for nearly a year ago. She kind of had to keep it on the down low until everything was finalized last month, and then she was officially sworn in. So I had a chance to catch up with her late on Thursday about her new role and her insights into small business concerns with the increasing tax burden in Washington state. And lastly, my colleagues Tim Clauser and TJ Martinell share a fascinating conversation about real estate trends for the haves, not the have nots, the haves here in Washington state. It seems that many wealthy residents are not waiting around for any impacts of the income tax before they put the for sale sign on their home. It's pretty fascinating to see, just like from last year to this year, how things have changed and how rapidly they have changed. So let's dive into today's episode of Washington in Focus Daily. So Let's Go Washington announced on Thursday they are suing Secretary of State Steve Hobbs over his decision to block a public vote on the new state law, the new millionaires tax. The Political Action Committee, LGW, claims that Hobbs has misquoted the Constitution in his denial of the request to let voters weigh in. And much of the argument centers around the emergency clause in the bill's language that blocks any potential referendum on it. Lawmakers attach these clauses when they feel it's an emergency. Without this, the whole state budget's going to fall apart. We can't keep, state agencies operating. And so they attach this clause and essentially makes those bills referendum proof. They've been doing that a whole heck of a lot more in the last couple of years. In fact, I think during the 2025 session, we had close to, was it 200 or 400 bills? Really, it was that high that had the clause attached. It was a record, and I think we came close to that in the 2026 legislative session. So here is part of my conversation with Let's Go Washington's founder, Brian Haywood, earlier this morning.
This sounds like we're really getting into the weeds, and aren't you playing with words? But in legal documents and in constitutional documents, the commas and the or fors matter and have enormous changes in what they mean. And in this particular case, because it says it has to be, this is basically giving the legislature a get out of jail free card to say, sorry, voters, this is something that's so important, you don't get to have a say. Wow. And it was designed this is really literally what a check and a balance is. It's designed to give the legislature a tool when there's an emergency, an immediate need for it, necessary for the immediate preservation of public peace, health and safety, support of the state government. When it's necessary for those things, then they can have an emergency clause and they can prevent a referendum on the law. However, what they've done is they've said, or for, which means basically either it's immediate or we need it for the state government, right? If you just support of the state government, if that's your criteria, pretty much everything that the legislature does is for the support of the state government. And so it means that it completely eliminates any check on
Wow.
the government. And they've re like the most telling thing to me is that this is what the Secretary of State wrote to us, right? Necessary or for the support of the state government. The legislature has taken this stance. This is their interpretation. It's the stance that they've taken. I think they've tried a couple of times. There's been some court cases around this, but they're just basically saying, "Hey, we don't think anyone can challenge us on this." And so our first step here is to challenge them on this very doctrine itself.
So Haywood and Let's Go Washington argue that the clause is invalid, and they plan again to bring this issue to the state Supreme Court to clarify the limits of the clause in hopes of allowing a public vote. There's a real urgency here because if indeed somehow a referendum at this point is allowed to move forward, there's a very short window of gathering signatures. In fact, the deadline being June 10th, where they would have to have 200,000 signatures. So that is a very short window, something that Haywood believes is doable because of the, public resistance to the income tax, at least based on polling that we have seen. So he's going after the Secretary of State over the referendum denial and challenging how Hobbs has interpreted the constitutional language. At the same time, Let's Go Washington is preparing two initiative campaigns to repeal the income tax. And Haywood told me it's a lot easier and simpler for voters to understand a referendum. So it is worth this fight while they also work on the initiatives.
A referendum is up or down, do you support this law? So it's an easier thing for voters to vote on. And the legislature knows that. They know that a referendum, it's easier to get a no than it is to get a yes on a referendum. On any initiative, right? So with the initiative, I remember we were saying vote yes, pay less, because that's the message that we have to get people to understand. Oh, you have to vote yes to get rid of an income tax. With a referendum, it says should this law be upheld? No, get rid of that law, right? It's easier to get a no, and so that's an important thing as part of the process. And then the third thing on the referendum is that there's no financial impact statement that goes on a referendum. You just either support the law or you reject the law, and it goes away. And it doesn't give the attorney general the opportunity to propagandize on the ballot itself. So there's a lot of reasons that a referendum is important and valuable, and asking the Supreme Court to uphold this constitutional safeguard is not a fool's errand. But then we go to the people versus the legislature. If we do initiative to the people, we have to gather 400,000 signatures now between now and July 3rd. And then it would go on the ballot in November. So there's a short time frame, but if people remember, we got 540,000 signatures to stop the natural gas ban in about 45 days.
It's important to note that if it comes down to this repeal attempt being by initiative and the referendum is a no-go, there would be an initiative that would go directly to the people as well as one to the legislature. Now, assuming the one that goes directly to voters, and it would be this year, the November ballot, um, and assuming it's approved and the income tax is in fact repealed, it would stick for at least 2 years before lawmakers could start messing with an attempt to undo it again. When voters pass an initiative that goes directly to the people, lawmakers cannot undo that for at least 2 years. Whereas if an initiative to the legislature is approved, lawmakers can come back the very next year and undo it. Now, recall the parental rights initiative in not so distant history. They did that. It was adopted. The initiative went to the legislature. It was adopted by lawmakers almost unanimously, as I recall, only so they could come back then the next year, and House Bill 1296 was then approved, which basically repealed and some suggest even went further than the initial undoing of the parental rights law. So they did that in 1 year. So my point is, if in fact voters approve an initiative that goes directly to you on the ballot in November, lawmakers won't have next legislative session. They would have to wait 2 full years before they could come back and attempt any kind of a change. And remember, we have Two initiatives already on the ballot this November. One is, in fact, to restore parental rights, and the other is to protect girls in sports and keep biological males out of women's sports and also out of locker rooms and bathrooms. This has been a huge fight. Based on the most recent polling I've seen, it seems voters are inclined to approve both of those measures. But in addition to that, it is likely at this point we're also going to have an attempt to repeal the recently passed, signed into law income tax on our November ballot. It's going to be a crowded ballot. And then one more thing on the income tax. Cadiff and former AG Rob McKenna are also planning a legal challenge, pulling together plaintiffs and determining which court venue they're going to file in. So there is a lot to keep track of on that front. Likely going to be the early part of next week before anything is filed along, on that Cadiff challenge and former AG Rob McKenna. Now, a former state lawmaker from the 25th legislative district, which includes Puyallup and some of the surrounding communities, has been tapped by the Trump administration and sworn in last week. This is Kelly Chambers. She was, again, a state lawmaker from the 25th, and now under the Trump administration, she's been tapped to be the regional administrator for the U.S. Small Business Administration. So she's got 4 states in her territory. It's Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Alaska. Now, she is herself the co-owner of a local franchise for in-home senior aid provider Visiting Angels. So she's got her own small business knowledge. I think she's been doing that for about 20 years. Um, and she says really the threat now to small businesses here in the state of Washington from the crushing tax burden, even before the income tax goes into effect, is really a threat to the American dream, as she sees it. It is a pathway now threatened for so many people, and now the income tax yet to come. So it may be the last straw for many. We've reported on that here at Washington in Focus Daily with some of the concerns being raised by small business groups. The National Federation for Independent Business has weighed in on this. Lots of worry about that. So now we've got Kelly Chambers in her new role with the Trump administration as a small business administration regional administrator, and her advocacy for business here in Washington state may be more critical than ever.
I've seen for years, people moving out of state, and I think the passage of the income tax is really putting the pressure on, and it's really escalating people to finally pull the trigger, and they're making those moves. I talked to a business this morning that opened up in Pierce County a couple years ago, and they said we have 7 years left on our lease, and we are already starting to look where to relocate. So, some businesses are tied into leases and things that tie them geographically to Washington, but it's not lost on them the bigger picture of if they're going to have long-term success, where they need to go in order to operate successfully.
Now, Chambers told me she knows there are many burdensome regulations on small business and some contradictions really between federal and state laws. And the SBA has an Office of Advocacy where they call them red tape hotline complaints. And you can see that here. She asked me specifically in our interview to say, make people aware of this hotline. People are under a crushing burden of regulations. Again, those contradictions between what the state of Washington is requiring versus what the federal administration is requiring. She says the Trump administration is more sympathetic to that now than ever, really trying to give small business a hand up. And so she wanted to bring attention to that hotline where it says here, you can make a complaint if regulations that are costly, confusing, outdated. There are permitting or licensing delays, duplicative or conflicting rules, excessive paperwork, or unclear guidance. So if you simply Google SBA red tape hotline, you can find more information on that. And she really encouraged any small business operator who, is maybe dealing with some of these issues to file that complaint and get some help from the SBA. And we've got her now in our corner for small business interests in the state of Washington. Um, we've talked a lot about business leaders relocating. I want to bring your attention again to some of the recent coverage we did. Association of Washington Business, they did a survey. I think it was produced back on February the 5th, and there were 400 plus members that participated in this survey. And they found 44% of business leaders in Washington state considering moving their personal residence out of the state. 44%. That was in Western Washington. It was even higher. It was 56% of business owners in Eastern Washington considering, re-domiciling, getting the heck out of here, especially before this income tax goes into effect. Doesn't necessarily mean they're going to relocate their business, but that same survey from AWB did find that 17% of business owners in the state of Washington say they have begun to consider whether it makes sense to continue operations here in the state of Washington or uproot everything, relocate employees, relocate what they do. Of course, not everybody can do that. But that was pretty fascinating statistic. And that just year over year had more than doubled because that same survey a year prior found only 9% of business owners, AWB members, saying they are considering relocating their business. So thing 3 for today, and all in keeping with our theme of taxes and people thinking about getting the heck out of Dodge, my colleagues Tim Clauser and TJ Martinell have details on the increase in high value homes on the market. There's a heck of a lot of them, apparently. This isn't the, you know, guy down the street from me who's got his house for sale for $600,000. No, these are the big players. These are the guys that, have a place with a view of Lake Washington or, maybe located in Queen Anne or Magnolia or some of those other rich neighborhoods. This is fascinating because it seems that whether it's the new income tax or just other crushing tax burdens and this whole tax the rich theme that we've been pushing in the state of Washington, it's a very real thing. So here's that conversation with TJ and Tim.
Welcome to another episode of Washington in Focus. I'm your host, Tim Clauser, with the Center Square's Washington State investigative reporter, TJ Martinell, here to talk about the state income tax again, which is fresh off the governor's desk. But not just that, but all the people that could be potentially leaving the state because of this new tax. TJ, you spoke with a realty group that operates in and out of Washington State. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what they told you?
Well, pretty much, I mean, the reality is that the market doesn't lie and realtors go where the demand is. And so what we're seeing is this basically a movement of people who've got wealth or high income leaving Washington State, maybe not for good, but they're leaving in terms of their residencies. So they're going to places like Las Vegas, to Florida, to Tennessee, to Idaho. But with this realty group that I spoke to, they've created an entire campaign for highlighting Las Vegas for people from Washington State. And it's not just because of this reason, but one of the things that they use to attract people to buy these. And when I say like who their clients are, we're talking about people who can afford $20 million homes. So this is not just random, somebody who's buying a little starter home Rambler. We're talking about somebody who has enough capital to spend $20 million on a home. And the whole campaign is that they have no income tax down there. So, and so it's not just them doing these campaigns. They're not doing these campaigns just for political purposes I think it needs to be understood. They're doing these things because that's where the demand is. These are business people. They're making business decisions. And we look at the data, and the data that I just got the other day from a real estate organization that tracks this kind of stuff. The number of listings, pending sales, and actual sales has increased dramatically for homes that are worth $5 million or more so far this year compared to last year. Sales for $5 million or more in King County are up 66% compared to the same time frame from last year. So we're seeing a lot of people selling their homes, and this isn't so much a reflection of what's happening to the market. It's not about the value changing of real estate property. It's about the fact that people who have the money that is going to be taxed by this income tax or by the real estate not real estate, the estate tax, they're moving their wealth and they're moving their residency out of the state so that they're not subject to these taxes that are then going to have a lot less revenue coming in than they anticipated. And so there's implications for how that's going to affect other Washington residents who are currently not subject to the tax because of the exemption in the bill.
Mhm. And Governor Ferguson, the majority party Democrats in Washington state, throughout the 2026 legislative session, they kept making this claim that capital flight wasn't to be worried about. Maybe it would be there to a certain degree, but it wouldn't be substantial. When the topic of the Seattle Supersonics and NBA team potentially returning to Seattle was brought up, this concern was also raised, and the governor again said, look, the majority of the nation, all these other states have income taxes, and it's not pushing away these opportunities. I mean, from what you're seeing and what these realtors are seeing, could these few very wealthy, affluent people have an impact on the state's economy?
Yeah, so I think that the issue is that they're not going to get as much revenue as they anticipated, and so they're going to use that to justify lowering the threshold so that more and more people have to pay the income tax, because this was pitched as a millionaire's tax, and let's put aside the constitutional arguments, the legal arguments for why it's you know not lawful.
Mhm.
People are like, well, it doesn't apply to me. Well, okay, there's two things. The people who could pay the tax move because they got the money to do it. So they don't end up paying the tax. If they're employers, they could take their jobs with them, which means people who could afford to live here because of their job now have to move and sell their place. And then you've got people where the tax suddenly applies to them because they're not getting the revenue they want.
Uh, just for a refresher for those listening, I mean, this new income tax, it's a 9.9% tax on annual income above $1 million. So they exempt that first $1 million, but say you're making $1.1 million, you got to pay about 10% on that extra $100,000. Or if you're making $20 million, you're going to be spending or paying that tax on the other 19 million. But if they were to drop this threshold, and Democrats were very cautious this recent session as to whether or not they will return to the income tax next year or in the years later, to reduce that threshold. But you're speaking to very wealthy people having the resources to relocate out of the state to avoid this tax, even if they're not leaving the state altogether. But what about the people that can't avoid this? Should they lower the threshold? Do we expect to see home sales skyrocketing even for the lower and middle class? Or is it kind of just something that they're not going to be able to avoid?
I mean, there's a lot of different things that could come out of this. You could have the tech sector basically pack up and leave. I mean, how many layoffs have occurred with the tech sector recently? And the tech sector, for people who really don't know or don't follow our economy or our state budget, that's pretty much how the state's been able to get away with its spending increases over the years, because it's really been driving our economic growth. And so if the tech sector goes down or something happens to it, not only are the jobs lost, they got to sell their homes, they got to move, whatever, and they're not paying the tax. So now you've got that going on. And then when these people lose their jobs, they're going to be looking at places to go. They're not going to stay in a state that has an income tax, a capital gains tax, and doesn't have the weather of California, and there is talent here, but it's it's creating what many people would consider to be disincentives to continue staying. But more importantly, it's a disincentive for people who are not in Washington state to come here in the first place.
And people might hear tech sector and think, that's really broad. Who does that really mean? And I think just putting a few faces to that can really show the extent that this, or the impact that this tax might have. I mean, we saw even prior to its passage, when it was being rumored about and the capital gains tax was increased, we saw Amazon's Jeff Bezos leave Seattle. We've recently heard the CEO of Starbucks wanting to leave Washington and heading to Tennessee. We've heard pro-tax advocates such as Nick Hanauer moving to other states. It's interesting to see all these people leaving the state, and with them, these industries go, or at least to some extent, and the trickle down effect that that could have on the economy in years to come. I mean, we're just starting to see this start now. I mean, what's to say the impact could be 10 years from now? I mean, 10 years ago today, the state budget was about half the size of it is now. I mean, are we going to reach a breaking point, or are they just going to find a new way to increase spending, whether that be reducing the threshold on this income tax or other measures?
I mean, what we could very likely see in 2027, 2028 is legislative sessions. If there's any kind of recession and they're facing a 10 billion, 12, 15 billion dollar shortfall, we're going to see some it's going to be, it won't be boring, I'll put it that way, because you're going to have people who just will not cut spending no matter what. You're going to see lawmakers that will just want more and more taxes and just double down. So then there's going to be people who are going to say, we don't have the money, it's not going to come in. It's going to be interesting to see policymakers who have ideological agendas go confront people who are economists and who deal with just math. And where, suddenly 2 + 2 = 4 is a political statement where you just say that these numbers don't add up. And so that's what I could see definitely happening. And it's not just the impacts, but that what we're seeing is people are taking their money outside the state, so it can't be taxed by Washington, and obviously won't be used as tax revenue. And we've seen this with Jeff Bezos, like you mentioned, or Howard Schultz or whatever, where they're moving to other states and they're making financial decisions at the time that would have cost them if they'd stayed in Washington state. And so Washington state didn't get that revenue anyways.
And for those who are skeptical that the state will increase spending with limited means or thinning means, just this year, they closed a $2 billion deficit, largely with reserves. Last year, or 2 years ago, they faced a $12 to $16 billion deficit that they filled with the largest tax hike in state history that they somewhat reverted in this most recent session due to its impact on low and middle class families. But definitely interesting to see, something we'll keep our eyes on. Very surprised to see these realtor campaigns popping up in these tax havens trying to attract Washington residents. But TJ, appreciate you covering this. And for anyone hoping to read that story, you can catch it at thecentersquare.com. Otherwise, thank you for joining us for another episode of Washington in Focus.
So that is it for today's episode of Washington in Focus Daily for this Good Friday. Another wrap on a very busy week. I wish you a happy Good Friday and a happy Easter. And I appreciate you watching. Join us again next week.